The room went dead silent. Playing hero. That is what Dr. Mercer said when he closed his office door, his voice low and controlled as a predator assessing wounded prey. She hadn't even clocked in yet. Hadn't touched a single patient file. Just walked through the ER bay of Cedar Creek Medical in Raleigh wearing fresh scrubs and a 2-month-old badge, and somehow he already knew about the bus stop. Already knew about the stranger gasping like a fish pulled from water. Already knew she'd done something he would spend the next 10 minutes tearing apart with surgical precision. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that he was right to know. The traffic cameras had caught everything. Katie Rodriguez kneeling on concrete at the corner of Fayetteville and Morgan at 6:48 in the morning, her hands moving with the kind of certainty that doesn't come from 2 months of nursing school experience. It comes from something older. Something she was supposed to keep buried. 24 hours earlier, she had been standing at the bus stop with her backpack unzipped, pretending to search for her transit pass. The March sun was climbing hot over Raleigh, and she was counting the passengers, 9, all within normal threat radius, none with the telltale weight distribution of a concealed weapon. Habit. Old habits died hard in people like her. People who had spent for years walking through streets where the wrong passenger could mean the difference between making it home or being carried home in a flag. That's when the man collapsed. He went down like a sack dropped from a height, his breathing coming in desperate, drowning gasps. Tension pneumothorax. She knew it the instant she saw the way his chest wasn't moving symmetrical, the way his neck veins bulged like they were trying to escape his body, the way his oxygen saturation was plummeting with each labored breath. A collapsed lung. Trapped air pushing against his heart. 90 seconds until cardiac arrest if someone didn't do something. A woman screamed. A man was filming on his phone. Nobody moved. Nobody knew what to do. Katie's hands moved before her mind caught up. Muscle memory. For tours in Ramadi had taught her that pain was information, and information was survival. She'd done a needle decompression 17 times under mortar fire. She could do it in her sleep. She could do it while dying. The 14-gauge angiocath needle went in smooth between the second and third ribs, midclavicular line, angled slightly toward the armpit to miss everything vital. The hiss of air escaping, that sweet, terrible sound of a lung re-expanding. His oxygen saturation climbing like it had somewhere urgent to be. 68, 72, 79, 84. His breathing synchronized back into human rhythms, desperate but regular, the way a drowning man's breathing becomes regular once his lungs remember how. She didn't flinch. Didn't explain. Didn't wait for applause. The sirens were already screaming 3 blocks away. She checked his pulse, strong, military-grade steady, and something about the set of his shoulders, even in distress, told her this was a man who'd spent time in uniform. Different uniform than hers, probably. The kind with more brass, fewer scars. When the ambulance pulled up, Katie handed him off to the paramedics with the precision of someone who'd done 100 combat casualty care handoffs. Vitals. Procedure performed. Mechanism of injury. No speculation. No emotion. Just data. Just facts. Just the kind of clinical detachment that gets people killed if you're off by even 1 decimal point. Needle decompression performed at scene, she said, her voice steady as a surgical laser. Second intercostal space, midclavicular. Patient was gasping. Respiratory distress. No pulse ox available at scene. The lead paramedic, a man with 20 years of lines around his eyes, nodded like he'd heard this kind of information from someone who actually knew what they were doing. Good work, he said. And then they were gone, lights and sirens painting the morning red and blue, and Katie was standing alone at the bus stop while 17 people held their phones up and filmed the space where she'd been. She disappeared into the crowd before anyone could ask her name. Now, in Dr. Mercer's office, she stood with her hands folded and her face arranged in the expression of someone who was sorry about almost everything, someone who understood that speaking was a privilege and silence was safety. Her badge was still clipped to her scrubs. Cedar Creek Medical, registered nurse, Catherine Rodriguez, license effective date, January 3rd. 2 months and 11 days. Dr. Mercer sat behind his desk like he owned it. Like he owned her, maybe. He was the kind of man who'd built his authority brick by brick from smaller people's compliance, and Katie could read that in his posture the way she could read hostile intent in a crowd. His power source was social, one phone call and he could end her career, and he knew she knew it. That knowledge lived in the space between them like something with teeth. "I've reviewed the footage," he said. His office smelled like expensive cologne and something underneath it, something faintly bitter. Resentment, maybe. You made a decision. A significant medical decision. Without authorization. Without oversight. Without the faintest idea of what you were doing. She didn't respond. Silence was the safest answer. 2 months, he continued, his voice dropping even lower, which somehow made it more dangerous. 2 months you've been on this unit, and you think you understand the scope of your practice? You think you get to decide what constitutes an emergency? What constitutes your responsibility? Still nothing. Katie's jaw was steady. Her breathing was steady. Her hands were steady in a way that would have gotten her killed in Ramadi if her hands ever trembled, so her hands had learned not to. "I have protocols," Mercer said. He was warming up now, finding his rhythm like a preacher finding scripture. Protocols that exist for a reason. Protocols that protect patients. Protocols that protect you. You know what happens when nurses decide they're above the system? When they decide the rules don't apply because they had one moment where they thought they were playing doctor. He leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked beneath him. "Lawsuits," he said. "Liability. Investigations. And every single one of those damages this hospital. Damages me. Damages the rest of the team who've been here long enough to understand how we actually operate." Katie felt the weight of his words like pressure in a deep place. This was the social attack, the first escalation. The thing designed to make a person of normal conscience feel small and ashamed and complicit in their own destruction. It was working exactly as designed. She could feel the moment where a regular person would start to crumble, start to apologize, start to internalize the idea that helping someone was a violation. She wasn't a regular person. "You put yourself in a position to be sued," Mercer continued, his voice like honey poured over broken glass. "You put this hospital in a position to be sued. You put every person on this unit at risk because you couldn't contain your savior complex for long enough to let the professionals handle it." The question came at her like a test disguised as genuine curiosity. "What made you think you had the authority to touch that patient?" Katie waited. She waited the way soldiers wait, without impatience, without defensiveness, with the absolute certainty that the right moment always arrives if you just stay still long enough. She had her hands folded. Her badge was visible. Her uniform was clean. She was in her composure, the one that had kept her alive through 4 tours and 3,000 kilometers of hostile territory. The composure of someone who understood that words were weapons and silence was armor. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. Quieter than it had any right to be, given the weight it carried. "I'd rather answer for someone living than explain why I let them die." Mercer blinked. That was his only tell, just that one flicker of surprise, the way a predator looks when it realizes the thing it's hunting might have teeth. Then his face hardened, his hands gripped the armrest of his chair like he might strangle something with them, and Katie knew she'd just made a decision that would cost her. She turned and walked toward the door. "We're not finished here, Rodriguez," he said. His voice was sharp now, and that sharpness told her he was angry in a way that would require options to contain. Would require actions. Would require the first real move in a game she hadn't known they were playing. Not even close. Katie opened the door. The sound of the ER beyond it, monitor beeping, shoes clicking on tile, the distant mechanical wheeze of a ventilator, flooded into that small office like air into collapsed space. She didn't look back. Didn't acknowledge that he was still talking. just stepped through and let the door close behind her with a soft click, the kind of soft click that somehow carried more finality than any slam ever could. And that was the moment everything changed. That was the moment Dr. Mercer decided she needed to be taught a lesson. That was the moment the real game began. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and something Katie couldn't quite identify, desperation, maybe. She set her lunch down at the only empty table, pulled out the plastic chair, and sat down. The three nurses at the far table stopped talking mid-sentence. They didn't look at her. They just gathered their containers, their yogurt cups, their half-empty water bottles, and left. All of them. Within 30 seconds, Katie was alone with her sandwich and the fluorescent lights humming their mechanical dirge above her head. She didn't watch them go. She opened her lunch bag instead, hand steady, jaw clenched tight as a fist. Muscle memory from Ramadi. Never show the hit. Never let them see it land. She bit into the sandwich and chewed, each motion deliberate, each swallow a small act of defiance. The break room was silent except for the refrigerator's compressor cycling on and off like a metronome counting down to something neither of them wanted to name. By Friday, the formal write-up appeared on the unit board in the nursing station. Unauthorized field intervention. Potential liability exposure. Her name spelled out in Arial font, bold-faced, laminated, and thumbtacked next to the staff birthday calendar and a poster about hand hygiene. Katie photographed it with her phone. Her hands didn't shake. She texted the image to a number that would delete itself in 10 seconds, and the response came back in 30, Mercer escalating. Maintain position. Mission critical. What Dr. Mercer didn't understand was that Katie wasn't just a nurse. She was Captain Katie Rodriguez, Army Ranger Medical Corps, deployed undercover to a specific patient in this specific hospital, and blowing her cover meant blowing the entire operation. The general upstairs, the man she'd pulled back from the edge of death at that bus stop, was recovering from emergency cardiac surgery in the secure wing on the 4th floor, monitored 24/7 by teams he didn't even know were there. Katie's job at Cedar Creek wasn't about saving lives in the ER. It was about keeping one particular life safe long enough to get him to Walter Reed Medical Center, where the real security apparatus could take over. Which meant she couldn't defend herself. Couldn't explain. Couldn't do anything but absorb Mercer's attacks and maintain the fiction that she was just a terrified new nurse who'd made a terrible mistake. During afternoon rounds on Wednesday, Mercer stopped outside room for 12 where Katie was adjusting an 4-line on Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman with congestive heart failure and the kindest smile Katie had encountered in 6 weeks of 12-hour shifts. Mrs. Chen's daughter and son stood on either side of the bed, watching Katie work with the quiet trust of people who don't understand how fragile their mother's situation had become. Mercer leaned against the door frame. Nurse Rodriguez has some very interesting ideas about scope of practice, he said, his voice pitched to carry, his smile like a knife reflecting light. Tell me, Rodriguez, does your limited nursing judgment extend to questioning physician orders, or just performing unauthorized field procedures? He turned to Mrs. Chen's family. We take liability very seriously here. Patient safety, of course. Katie's knuckles went white on the 4-pole. She could feel her shoulders drawing up, her breath coming short and controlled. She said nothing. She finished securing the line, checked the drip rate, and documented it in the chart while Mercer waited for a response that wasn't coming. The silence stretched like a rubber band pulled too far. Mrs. Chen's daughter glanced at her mother, then back at Katie, then at Mercer, confusion crossing her face like a cloud moving across water. Room for 07 needs their afternoon medications, Katie said, her voice flat as a desert floor. I'll be back to check on you in 20 minutes, Mrs. Chen. She walked past Mercer without meeting his eyes. It wasn't submission. It was strategy. Captain Rodriguez had learned long ago that the fastest way to neutralize an opponent was to deny them the fight they wanted. Let him think he was winning. Let him believe the pressure was breaking her. Every second he wasted trying to bait her into an emotional response was a second the hospital's security systems weren't scrutinizing the 4th floor secure wing. 2 days later, Katie entered room for 28 in the secure section where General Marcus Webb was recovering. The room was all stainless steel and monitoring equipment, soft beeping creating a rhythm that felt almost organic after the chaos of the main hospital. A closed-circuit camera watched from the corner, and she knew at least 3 people were watching the feed from somewhere she'd never be allowed to go. The general lay sedated but stable, his chest wrapped in post-surgical dressings that needed changing. His brother sat in a corner chair reading a Tom Clancy novel. The cover was worn, the pages dog-eared, the kind of book that had been read 100 times before. He was in his 60s, maybe, with the kind of stillness that only came from decades of military discipline. Former Army. Combat medic, according to the visitor log. Clearance vetting in progress. Katie had read the notes her handler had left in the secure shared drive. She began unwrapping the surgical site with careful, professional movements. The adhesive released with a soft sound, sticky tape peeling away to reveal the incision beneath, clean, healing well, no signs of infection. She soaked a piece of sterile gauze in normal saline and began gently debriding the wound edges, removing the loose tissue with a kind of economical precision that you didn't learn in a 2-week nursing program. You learned that kind of precision by doing it under fire, with IED blast wounds and shrapnel lacerations and the clock ticking down while a 19-year-old kid from Nebraska tried not to bleed out on your hands. The brother watched her for exactly 30 seconds before leaning forward. "Remedy," he said quietly. Katie's heart detonated against her ribs. She didn't stop working. Her hands moved with the same steady rhythm, the same mechanical competence. She shook her head sharply, not quite hostile, but definitive, the kind of no that doesn't leave room for follow-up questions. "I trained at University of North Carolina," she said. Her voice came out level. Professional. Nothing underneath it but routine. "Are you staying in town long?" The brother studied her face the way combat medics study wounds, looking for the hidden damage, the infection you can't see on the surface. Then he nodded slowly. "Beautiful weather this time of year," he said. "Might stay another week or so. Spend some time with my brother." Katie finished the dressing change, fresh sterile gauze, antibiotic ointment, tape applied with precision, chart updated with times and observations and the kind of clinical language that revealed nothing. Her pulse had settled back down to something approaching normal, though her hands remembered that spike of adrenaline. Recognition was the death of deep cover. One question asked to the wrong person at the wrong time, and the entire operation unraveled like a sweater caught on a fence. She kept working as if nothing had happened. The brother kept reading his book. General Webb slept the chemical sleep of post-operative sedation, and the monitors kept beeping their steady rhythm, and Katie finished the procedure and documented everything in meticulous detail. 8 minutes from start to finish. Professional. Clean. Invisible. In the hallway, her phone buzzed against her hip. A message from the encrypted app, already disappearing as she read it, * possible compromise. Combat medic recognized technique. Advise. The response came 30 seconds later, * maintain cover. Mission critical. Web transfers to Walter Reed in 10 days if stable. You hold the line. Katie deleted both messages and walked toward the nurse's station, already composing her next set of vital sign reports, already thinking 3 moves ahead like a chess player who'd learned the game on a base in Baghdad. Her breathing was steady. Her expression was neutral. She was just a nurse heading back to work. Then she saw Mercer waiting for her by the station with a clipboard and a predatory smile that looked like hunger wearing a doctor's coat. "Rodriguez," he said, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "My office. We need to discuss some concerns about your charting accuracy." She followed him because refusing would draw attention. Because the mission came first. Because sometimes the bravest thing you could do was swallow the insult and keep walking toward the next crisis, the next shift, the next opportunity to protect the asset who didn't even know her name. The elevator doors closed behind them, and Katie thought about Remedy, about the flag folded tight in her nursing bag, about the teammate she'd held in her arms while his blood pooled on desert sand. Some debts didn't expire just because you changed uniforms. Dr. Mercer moved through the Raleigh Country Club like a man who understood the precise architecture of power. 3 lunch meetings in 5 days. 3 separate board members. Each conversation identical in its architecture, different only in the details that mattered most to each listener. With Chairman Hayes, it was liability. A nurse with 2 months on staff performing field surgery without oversight. What happens when her next intervention goes wrong? When a family decides to sue? Hayes nodded over his $16 salad, pen moving across his leather portfolio. With board member Conrad, it was credentialing. Her nursing school transferred records unusually fast. Her previous employment references are vague. I'm not suggesting anything irregular, but we have due diligence obligations. Conrad's jaw tightened. He was a lawyer, detail-oriented, obsessed with procedure. With Bancroft, it was the simplest argument of all: she's undermining institutional authority. Nurses don't make clinical calls without physician oversight. That's not heroism. That's insubordination. 3 conversations. 3 hooks embedded in 3 different fears. And by the end of lunch on Thursday, all 3 men had agreed to support a formal investigation. That afternoon, Mercer made the calls to Katie's fabricated references. His assistant had printed them from her personnel file, Cedar Valley School of Nursing in Asheville, North Carolina. 2 preceptor names. 2 phone numbers that looked authentic because they routed through a Pentagon cover office designed for exactly this scenario, protecting deep cover operatives from credential verification that got too aggressive. The voice on the line at the first number was crisp, professional, careful. When Mercer asked about Katie's clinical rotations, the response was oddly circumspect. She was a solid performer in our program. Mercer made a note, *vague language despite direct questioning *. When he pressed about specific patient outcomes or competency assessments, the voice became even more guarded. I'm not sure I'm at liberty to discuss, and Mercer smiled, because a real nursing school would have given him a 20-minute detailed breakdown of clinical hours and rotation sites. This evasion, this careful non-answer, told him everything he needed to know. The second reference was identical. Professional. Non-committal. The exact way someone speaks when they're reading from a prepared script rather than recalling actual memories. By Friday morning, Sandra Vega was sitting in Mercer's office. She was in her 50s, with the bone-tired competence of a woman who'd spent 2 decades rooting out fraud and credential irregularities from healthcare systems. Her suit was gray. Her notes were taken in blue pen with the precision of someone who testified in court. Mercer had worked with her before, twice, successfully. Twice, she'd found what he needed her to find. "Walk me through your concerns," Vega said, opening a fresh legal pad. Mercer handed her Katie's personnel file. Vega's eyes moved across each document with methodical intensity, and Mercer watched her expression shift subtly as she absorbed the details he'd highlighted in red. The employment gap, 3 years unaccounted for between her supposed nursing school graduation and her start date at Cedar Creek. The nursing license transfer that had processed in 14 days instead of the typical 6 to 8 weeks. The recommendation letters themselves, each one exactly 3 paragraphs, each one using identical structural phrasing. These recommendations, Vega said, tapping the pages with her pen. They read like templates. Exactly, Mercer said. Military precision. No personal anecdotes. No specific patient interactions. Just abstract competency statements. Vega made notes. The reference is verified. Evasive on direct questions. That's what makes it interesting. They didn't deny anything. They just wouldn't provide specifics that would normally be routine. Vega set down her pen and looked at Mercer directly. "You think she's running from something? Criminal record under a different name?" "I think," Mercer said carefully, "that her credentials don't align with any verifiable history. And until they do, she's a liability." That afternoon, Katie watched from the nurse's station as Mercer emerged from his office with Vega. The older woman carried Katie's personnel file like it was evidence in a murder trial. They descended the corridor together, and Katie saw Mercer gesture toward the administrative wing where the secure files were kept. She heard the ding of the elevator. Watched the doors close. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a sound like the world breathing just slightly wrong. Katie's hands remained steady as she updated a patient's medication chart, but her mind had already mapped the geometry of the trap closing around her. She could make 2 phone calls. One to her commanding officer in the Pentagon. One to the DOD legal liaison who handled cover compromises. The words were ready, * civilian cover threatened. Extraction required. * within 4 hours, a medical transport would arrive to transfer General Webb to Walter Reed under the pretense of specialized cardiac care. Katie would accompany him as his attending nurse, legitimate cover for her presence on a military installation. The investigation would dissolve because Katie Rodriguez would no longer exist. She'd revert to Captain Rodriguez, and Mercer's entire case would collapse when his fabricated references suddenly became irrelevant to a woman who no longer had a civilian identity to verify. But Webb's latest EKG had shown concerning arrhythmias that morning. His cardiac enzymes were still trending upward. The cardiologist's words hung in her memory, his stabilizing, but I wouldn't move him for at least 72 hours. 72 hours minimum before his heart could tolerate the stress of medical transport. 72 hours before the cover mattered less than the mission. Katie updated her handler at 6:41 p.m. from her car in the Cedar Creek parking lot. She typed the message in a cipher that looked like random text to anyone monitoring her phone, * asset profile compromised. External investigator engaged. Cover integrity degrading. * The response came within 3 minutes, * do not break cover. Asset transfer delayed 72 hours due to medical instability. Maintain position. * Maintain position. 3 days. 72 hours for a woman whose entire civilian identity was evaporating in real time. She drove home to the apartment on Oakmere Drive where Emma was waiting with Mrs. Chen, the neighbor who watched her on late shifts. Katie took her daughter's hand and climbed the stairs to their second-floor unit, the space that had been home for 2 months but felt increasingly temporary, like a hotel room she'd rented to pass through. The next morning, Katie still hadn't undressed from her shift. She sat at the kitchen table in her scrubs, the fabric clinging to her skin like a reminder of the person she was supposed to be. It was 2:07 p.m. Outside, the August heat pressed against the windows. Her badge sat on the table next to a cold cup of coffee, the Cedar Creek medical logo catching light at angles that made it look like it belonged to someone else. Emma came through the door at 2:13 p.m. Mrs. Chen had picked her up from school, and the 8-year-old was still wearing her backpack, still clutching the folder containing her second-grade artwork and announcements. She stopped when she saw her mother at the kitchen table. "Mommy, why are you home?" The voice was small. Confused. The way children sound when the world stops matching the patterns they've memorized. Katie pulled her daughter close and held her, breathing in the scent of her hair, warm and sweet and smelling like playground dirt and elementary school. She pressed her lips against the top of Emma's head and felt the weight of her in her arms, real and solid and everything she couldn't protect if Mercer succeeded in stripping away her identity. "Everything's fine, baby," Katie said, and the lie came out as a whisper. "Everything's going to be okay." Emma rested against her mother's chest, and Katie's hand moved to her nursing bag, still slung over the chair. Her fingers found the interior pocket where she kept it, the flag. Folded with the precision of a military funeral, tri-folded into that perfect triangle, the cloth worn at the edges from 2 years of her clutching it on bad nights. From Ramadi. From a man named Sergeant Danny Halloway who'd bled out on her hands while she'd applied pressure and called for a trauma surgeon who never arrived because the IED had taken out the aid station too. She held the flag without removing it from the pocket, just her fingers pressing against the fabric through the cloth, and Emma asked, "Mommy, are you sad?" "No, sweetheart," Katie said. And her voice didn't break because that's not what Captain Rodriguez did. That's not what you learned in a war zone. That's not how you survived when everything else had already been taken. "I'm just thinking." Emma fell asleep against her mother's chest at 3:44 p.m., and Katie sat motionless in the kitchen, still wearing her scrubs, still holding the flag through the pocket of her bag, knowing that somewhere across the city, Dr. Mercer was building his case with the efficiency of a man who destroyed careers before, methodically, competently, with the precision of someone who understood that power was simply the willingness to follow something through to its conclusion. She had 72 hours to survive what was coming. 72 hours before General Webb's heart would be strong enough to move. 72 hours before she could take off the nurse's uniform and remember what it felt like to be something other than alone. Outside the window, the August heat shimmered off the asphalt, and Katie Rodriguez sat in the semi-darkness of her kitchen and held her sleeping daughter and waited for the walls to close in completely. The code blue alarm screamed through the cardiac unit at 2:24 p.m. on Tuesday, a sound like a banshee wailing through the corridors of Cedar Creek Medical. Katie heard it from inside the supply closet where she'd been counting endotracheal tubes and trying not to think about the suspension letter sitting on the administrator's desk with her name already typed. She moved anyway. Muscle memory didn't care about suspensions or investigations or the classified mission crumbling 2 floors above her head. The crash bay was controlled chaos. A 63-year-old woman 2 days post-op from valve replacement lay on the bed with her chest monitor showing the jagged, anarchic rhythm of ventricular fibrillation, a heart that had forgotten how to beat. Nurses moved with practiced urgency. And in the center of it all stood Dr. Mercer, frozen like a man staring into headlights, his hands visibly shaking as he fumbled with the defibrillator pads. 8 seconds. 9. His fingers couldn't find the placement points. His breathing had gone shallow. Katie watched him waste a full 10 seconds trying to position the pads incorrectly, and something inside her cracked open like a sealed door finally giving way. She crossed the room in 3 strides. "Move," she said. Mercer didn't process the command. He was still staring at the monitor, still shaking, still useless. Katie didn't give him another chance. She shoved him aside hard enough to send him stumbling backward into the crash cart, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. She didn't watch him fall. She was already reaching for the pads, already charging the defibrillator to 200 joules, already moving with the terrifying precision of someone who'd run codes under fire in a collapsed hospital in Raleigh with mortars bracketing the building. "Everyone clear," she barked, and her voice, the real voice, the one she'd been burying under nurse politeness for months, filled the room like a command that expected obedience. The nurses froze for half a second, then moved. They knew that timbre. They recognized authority when it was speaking. The shock delivered. Chest arched. Nothing. Resume compressions. Push 1 milligram epi 4. Her hands moved across the cart with the economical precision of someone who'd done this too many times to count. Charge to 300. Everyone clear. Shock delivered again. The monitor still showing that chaotic rhythm, that electrical storm where a heartbeat should be. 3 minutes. 2 shocks. The patient's rhythm converting back to sinus as if her heart had simply remembered it was supposed to keep her alive. Katie watched the green line stabilize on the monitor, watched the oxygen saturation climbing toward normal, watched the woman's chest rise and fall with the machine doing the work while her own body remembered how to conduct electricity. She stepped back from the bed, her hands still steady, her breathing controlled, her face the mask of someone who'd seen far worse than this. The room held its silence like a collective breath. Dr. Mercer was still sprawled against the crash cart, staring at her with something between rage and fear painted across his face, something that looked like a man watching the person he decided to destroy suddenly reveal they were built from something far stronger than his contempt could touch. Katie documented the code in the electronic medical record with the precision of military bureaucracy, time of onset, interventions, times, medications, dosages, patient response. Every detail. Every number. Every second accounted for. Then she walked back to her station and continued charting as if she hadn't just saved a woman's life, as if she hadn't just demonstrated command authority in front of the entire cardiac unit, as if the game wasn't already over and she hadn't just lost everything. Mercer made the first phone call from his office at 3:14 p.m. The second call came at 3:37. By 4:15, he was on a video conference with the hospital board members whose numbers were still in his contacts from 15 years of cocktail parties and golf weekends. Katie didn't see any of this. She was finishing her charting when Sandra Vega appeared at her station with the expression of someone who'd been ordered to deliver a death sentence and had decided to make it as quick as possible. "Katie," Sandra said quietly. "Administrator's office. Now." The conference room was arranged like a tribunal. Administrator Lewis sat at the head of the table with his hands folded in front of him. Mercer stood at the window with his back to the room, shoulders rigid. 2 HR representatives flanked the door. Sandra took a seat and wouldn't meet Katie's eyes. "The investigation into your credentials has raised substantial questions," Lewis began, reading from a prepared statement in the voice of someone reading bad news at a funeral. "We've contacted your references and discovered inconsistencies with your employment history. Pending the outcome of this investigation, Cedar Creek Medical is placing you on immediate suspension, effective immediately. You're being asked to surrender your badge and credentials and vacate the premises within 15 minutes. Katie didn't respond. What was there to say? That she was a captain in the United States Army Rangers? That her mission, protecting the Marine general who was currently recovering in the secure cardiac wing 2 floors above this very room, was still active? That defending herself would shatter the classified cover that kept a high-value intelligence asset alive? That she could stay silent or save her career, but not both? She stayed silent. Mercer turned from the window then, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who'd finally broken the thing he'd decided was a threat. His eyes were bright with the fever of victory. He smiled. He shouldn't have smiled. Katie's voice, when she spoke, was the calm before artillery strikes. "I need 15 minutes to clear my locker." 10, Lewis said. She walked out of the conference room while they were still shuffling papers, while Mercer was still wearing that expression, while the victory was still fresh on his face. She had no idea that the expression would be scrubbed away before sunset. She had no idea that the phone call he was about to make would be the last competent move he'd ever make. The locker was in the break room. Katie's hands didn't shake as she removed the few things she'd brought: a water bottle, a pair of compression socks, a spare badge holder. But she paused before closing the door. In the pocket of her locker, tucked inside a folded washcloth, was the flag. 13-fold triangle, red, white, and blue, the flag that had draped the coffin of First Sergeant Marcus Holloway at Arlington National Cemetery 3 years ago. The only piece of her real life she allowed herself to carry. The only tangible evidence that Captain Rodriguez had existed before she became just a nurse. She touched it once. Folded it carefully. Tucked it into her scrub pocket where it would stay close to her heart like a secret that nobody would ever understand. 2:15 p.m. Still wearing scrubs. Still smelling like the hospital, like antiseptic and diesel exhaust from the ambulance bay, like the ghost of her old life. She drove home in silence with the windows down and the August heat pressing against her skin like a threat. No radio. No phone calls. No requests for rides or updates or explanations. Just the sound of her own breathing and the certainty that she'd just sacrificed everything to keep a secret that nobody was supposed to know. Emma found her 20 minutes later. 8 years old. 2nd grade. Too smart for her own good. She came into the kitchen with her backpack slung over one shoulder and stopped when she saw her mother sitting at the kitchen table with her head in her hands, still wearing the uniform of a woman who was no longer allowed to work. "Mommy, why are you home?" Emma's voice was small and confused and frightened in the way that children's voices become when they understand that something has broken but don't yet understand what. Katie pulled her close, buried her face in her daughter's hair, and lied with the skill of someone who'd spent 7 months lying to entire hospitals. "Everything's going to be okay, baby. Everything's fine. Mommy just needs a day off." Emma held her for a moment, then asked the question that children always ask, "Mommy, why are you crying?" Katie realized then that she was crying. Not from shame or fear or the destruction of her cover, but from the realization that she'd just failed at the only thing that mattered. She'd failed to protect the mission. She'd failed to keep her daughter safe from the ripples of her own decisions. She'd failed at being anything other than a ghost in a hospital uniform, suspended between 2 lives and no longer belonging to either one. She held Emma closer and watched the afternoon light move across the kitchen table and waited for the walls to close in completely, knowing that they already had, knowing that she'd stepped into the code blue at 2:13 p.m. and never stepped back out. The background check went live at 4:48 p.m. on a Tuesday. HR submitted Katie's file to the North Carolina Board of Nursing, routine procedural step, nothing flagged in the initial scan. Except the form contained her social security number and military mailing address, cross-referenced against a database that wasn't supposed to exist outside Pentagon walls. Within 90 seconds, an automated alert triggered in a secure server at the Defense Intelligence Agency. Within 3 minutes, 2 more alerts cascaded upward, one to NCIS, one to a classified task force operating out of a building with no name on any government directory. By 4:51 p.m., a general's calendar had a new entry blocked in red. By 5:51 p.m., a helicopter was being prepped on a pad 32 miles away. Katie didn't know any of this yet. She was sitting in her kitchen with Emma asleep against her shoulder, rain hammering the window like it was trying to break through, watching the second hand on the clock move through minutes that felt like hours. The folded flag was in her nursing bag, tucked beneath the pocket where she kept her trauma shears. 2 years without wearing her rank. 2 years of being invisible. 2 years of watching other people take credit for things she'd done, of nodding and accepting correction from people who had never set foot in a combat zone, of keeping her mouth shut because the mission required it and the mission was all that mattered. But the mission had failed anyway. She'd failed. The general was upstairs recovering, but Katie wasn't his nurse anymore. She was suspended. Radioactive. By Friday the hospital would stop taking her calls. By next week she'd be looking for work at a clinic that didn't care about a termination from Cedar Creek. Emma would spend her 9th birthday asking why Mommy looked sad. The phone rang at 6:34 p.m. Not her personal cell. Her work phone, the one she'd turned off 3 hours ago. She didn't answer it. She couldn't explain anything anymore. There was nothing to explain. She'd chosen the mission and lost her career. She'd chosen her daughter and lost her home. She'd chosen both and become neither. The rain kept falling. The clock kept moving. Emma slept on, her breathing soft against Katie's collarbone, and Katie closed her eyes and waited for something to give. At Cedar Creek Medical, the administrator's office erupted into controlled chaos at 7:15 p.m. 2 officers in dress uniforms appeared in the lobby without announcement, walked directly past security, and asked for the hospital director by rank and last name. The director called the administrator. The administrator looked at the credentials they'd presented, NCIS, federal authority, no further questions needed, and suddenly her evening was about something much bigger than a nurse who'd exceeded her scope of practice. General Marcus Webb was already dressed and waiting when they came to his room on the secure wing. Not waiting like a patient recovering from surgery. Waiting like a commander preparing for a briefing. He'd been expecting this for hours. The moment the security flag had pinged him personally, he'd known exactly how it would end. He dressed in Class A uniform, medals in their proper order, and didn't look surprised when the duty officer escorted him downstairs to the administrative offices on the 2nd floor. The call came to Katie's home at 7:51 p.m. Cedar Creek Hospital. Administrator. Would she please report to the administrator's office immediately? Dress code, professional. No, she couldn't ask what this was about. Just come. Katie's hands didn't shake when she hung up. She laid Emma gently on the couch, covered her with the blanket from the back, and moved through the house with the mechanical efficiency of someone performing a task she'd already accepted as inevitable. She changed out of sweats into dark pants and a blazer. She pulled her hair into a bun. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror and saw a ghost, a woman who'd spent 2 months learning how to be a nurse and 2 years learning how to be nothing at all. The drive to Cedar Creek took 19 minutes. The parking lot was nearly empty at this hour. She rode the elevator to the 2nd floor feeling like she was ascending into a courtroom. She'd prepared for this. She knew exactly how to take termination with dignity. You didn't fight it. You didn't cry. You didn't explain. You simply accepted the consequence of choosing something other than what the institution demanded, and you walked out with your head level and your breathing steady. The administrator's assistant waved her through without making eye contact. Professional courtesy extended to the condemned. The conference room was full of faces Katie didn't recognize, plus the administrator, plus General Marcus Webb in full dress uniform with more medals on his chest than Katie had ever seen outside of official ceremonies. He was standing near the window. When she entered, he turned and looked directly at her. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. Viper 6. Katie's entire body went rigid. That call sign hadn't been spoken aloud in 2 years. That call sign belonged to a different woman, a woman in different clothes, operating under different rules, answerable to different chains of command. She tried to speak. Nothing came out. General Webb moved to the center of the room and opened a folder. His voice, when he began reading, carried the weight of official record, citation for exceptional service under fire. Ramadi, 2019. Sustained combat operations in the Jolin district. Multiple casualties treated under active fire. 2 soldiers saved who had no business walking away from that day alive. His voice was steady, measured, the kind of voice that had commanded men in places where mistakes meant body bags. He read through the first commendation without looking up, his eyes fixed on the paper, his voice filling the room until there was no space left for anything else. Dr. Mercer stood near the door, his face draining of color. "What is this? What the hell is happening?" General Webb didn't pause. He continued reading, his voice cutting through Mercer's question like it hadn't been asked. Bronze Star for Valor in combat. Second commendation. His presence had stabilized situations that would have become atrocities. His decisions under pressure had prevented a mass casualty event. He continued reading. Mercer moved toward the general. His voice rose. "General, I don't know what this is about, but I can explain my investigation into this nurse's credentials." General Webb raised one hand. A simple gesture, a raised palm, a movement that had probably silenced rooms full of junior officers before. Mercer stopped mid-word. The general continued reading without missing a beat, his voice dropping slightly lower, which made it somehow louder in the absolute silence. Silver Star. Third commendation. Acts of extraordinary heroism. Actions that reflected the highest traditions of the service. Purple Heart. Purple Heart. Actions that saved not just individual lives but the structural integrity of an entire operation. And finally, the last commendation, read with the kind of respect usually reserved for officers who'd given their lives, Navy Cross. Navy Cross was not given lightly. Navy Cross was given to people who'd done things that changed the calculus of what was possible under impossible circumstances. General Webb finished reading and lowered the folder. He did not sit down. He rose to his full height, 6'3", shoulders back, jaw set, and he stood at attention and rendered a full salute to a captain in scrubs who was standing in an administrator's office in Raleigh, North Carolina, 3,000 miles from the desert where she'd earned those medals. The silence in the room was absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. A man in a Pentagon liaison jacket stepped forward. His voice was formal, official, the kind of voice that came with federal authority backed by things that didn't exist on paper. Captain Catherine Rodriguez had been operating under direct Pentagon authorization throughout her civilian nursing assignment. Her civilian identity, her credentials, her employment at Cedar Creek Medical, all of it was federal cover for a classified operation. She was not a nurse practicing without proper authorization. She was a military asset engaged in a lawfully sanctioned federal operation. Any investigation into her credentials was, de facto, interference with national security operations. He said this while looking directly at Dr. Mercer. The board's medical school mentor, Dr. Philip Chen, Mercer's closest ally and most steadfast supporter through 2 decades of professional partnership, watched the viral video that Friday morning with his office door closed and his hands shaking. 15 seconds of footage, Mercer's voice dripping with contempt as he questioned Katie's judgment in front of a patient's family. 5 other clip segments showing similar patterns of public humiliation. The video had 17,000 shares by sunrise. By noon it had comments from 2 other hospitals documenting similar patterns of behavior under Mercer's leadership. Dr. Chen made one phone call. 5 minutes. That's all it took to tell the Cedar Creek board that he no longer recognized the man he'd mentored, that something had fundamentally fractured in Mercer's character, that he was recommending an immediate ethics review and distancing himself from any professional association with his former protégé. The board voted Sunday night. Suspended. Pending investigation. His office would be cleaned out by Monday morning. His name would be removed from the directory. His access would be revoked. His authority would be stripped as if it had never existed at all. On Monday, Katie returned to Cedar Creek in civilian clothes to collect her personal items from her locker. The nurses in the break room stood when she entered. Not mockingly. Actually stood. No one spoke. Respect carried more weight than words ever could. She didn't see Mercer that day, or the day after, or any day during the next 6 months while the investigation unfolded and his reputation unraveled and his career transformed into something unrecognizable. 6 months later, Captain Katie Rodriguez reported for duty at Walter Reed Medical Center in Arlington, Virginia, her Ranger tab freshly pinned to her uniform, her combat ribbons restored, her rank no longer a secret that needed hiding. First week. First month. New assignment. New team. New world where her authority was expected, her judgment was trusted, her experience was valued at its actual weight. She was walking through the outpatient clinic corridor during her 3rd week when she glanced through a window and saw him. Mercer. Unloading boxes from a medical supply van. White van, commercial insignia, a delivery clipboard in his hands. He was wearing a blue polo shirt with a company logo embroidered on the chest. His hair was grayer than she remembered. His shoulders were rounded in a way that hadn't been there before. She stopped walking and watched for exactly 30 seconds. He was arranging boxes on a cart with the kind of methodical care usually reserved for people who had nothing left to lose. His movements were jerky. His jaw was clenched. This man had held dominion over an entire emergency department. This man had shaped careers and ended careers and made decisions that rippled through hundreds of lives. Now he was unloading cardboard boxes for minimum wage plus mileage. His medical license hadn't been revoked. Cedar Creek's investigation had found ethical violations but nothing criminal. Nothing legally actionable. But Cedar Creek had reported him to the National Medical Board. The National Medical Board had flagged his license. No hospital would touch him. No clinic would hire him for clinical work. No institution wanted a doctor with a reputation that had been publicly destroyed on the internet, documented by his own staff, disowned by his own mentor. Katie watched him one more second, feeling nothing at all, and then she continued to the trauma bay where the day was waiting and the work was real and the people who needed saving outnumbered the people who deserved breaking. General Webb stopped by that afternoon in civilian clothes. He found Katie in the supply room and handed her an envelope. Handwritten letter from his brother, the combat medic who had almost exposed her cover, whose recognition of her skill had created days of terror, apologizing for nearly compromising her mission and expressing respect for her continued service. Katie read it twice and then folded it into her pocket. On Saturday, Emma visited and Katie gave her the full tour, finally explaining why Mommy had been gone so much, why Mommy sometimes came home looking like she'd seen things that needed forgetting. Emma's eyes went wide when she understood. Mommy wasn't just a nurse. Mommy was a soldier. Mommy had medals. That evening, in the hospital chapel, Katie unfolded the flag from Ramadi one last time. She whispered the names of the soldiers she hadn't been able to save, or 17 names, 17 faces, 17 lives that had depended on her hands working correctly and her decisions being right and the universe being slightly less cruel than it had the right to be. She folded the flag carefully and placed it in her office locker, not as a burden, but as a reminder. The past was honored. The past was respected. But the past didn't get to weigh down the future anymore. On her way out, she passed the loading area where Mercer was signing paperwork for his delivery completion. Their eyes met for approximately 1 second. He looked away first. Katie kept walking, because the ones who have seen the worst often give the most, and some victories don't require words. They just require outlasting the people who tried to break you. If you found yourself rooting for Katie throughout this story, please like and subscribe for more stories of quiet strength and hard-won vindication. Comment below, what would you have done in Katie's position? And hit that notification bell to stay updated on new stories.